Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour. This is your host, Bill Frezza. Today we're discussing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB, a creature of the Dodd-Frank law. It's a new regulatory agency given extraordinary regulatory powers. And with us is Todd Zywicki, George Mason University Foundation Professor of Law and editor of the Supreme Court Economic Review. Todd, welcome to the show.
Hi, Bill. Good to talk to you.
Now, the CFPB has been much in the news lately, none the least of which because it was our Senator Elizabeth Warren's springboard to fame. The premise behind all of this, as I understand it, is something called libertarian paternalism, which was developed by economist Richard Thaler and legal scholar Cass Sunstein, which is, I think, in the common parlance, has been called nudge, getting people to choose options that are better for themselves without creating undue burdens on the rest of society. Did I get that right?
That's right, Bill. That's basically the idea.
You know, how has this reflected itself in the structure of the CFPB?
The way libertarian paternalism matters is that you kind of have to go back in history, right? Which is that to some extent, what we're looking at is the way it plays out in the CFPB is kind of old wine in new bottles. Now, what we have to start with is think about old-style paternalism, which is if you go back to old-style consumer protection, sort of Ralph Nader and all that sort of stuff, basically what the idea was that the government knows better than you. And especially with respect to poor people and groups like that, the government would basically say, you don't make the right choices, and so we're going to choose things for you.
We'll make choices for you.
Yeah. And so what this new version, this libertarian paternalism version, tries to say is, we're not going to choose for you. But what we're going to do is we're going to take these findings from experimental economics and that sort of thing. And what we think is that there are situations where you want to do something, we're not choosing for you. You want to do something, and we are going to try to help you do what you want to do. So, for example, so saving money, right? So they might say everybody says they want to save more for retirement. Yet, because of various biases, impulse control, that sort of thing, people don't do it. So what they're going to do is they're going to nudge you. They're going to help you save more money because that's what you want to do yourself.
And this is what, through a set of payroll deduction options, or how does that reflect in actual policy?
What they recommend doing, for instance, is changing the default rules. So rather than you deciding how much to put into your 401k, your employer would essentially decide for you, and then you could change that rule. So rather than the rule being put as a zero and then you can add into it, they would say, in order to help you bring about what you want to do, we're going to help you pay more.
What evidence is there that this works? Where has this been tried?
It's never really been tried, and that's the catch with this is that it's built on a lot of different assumptions. First, it hasn't been tried that much in the real world, which is it's based on so-called experimental economics, where they do laboratory experiments about people how to make decisions.
College students that volunteer so they can get beer money. Okay, yeah, I remember that.
And then they extrapolate to the entire economy without recognizing that a lot of those findings are very contextual.
Wait, aren't there countries who have different opt-in and opt-out rules for organ donation, and that tends to really change the participation level?
That does, absolutely. So many countries have rules that presume that you are going to donate your organs when you die.
Unless you say otherwise. Right. And we do see that changing that rule changes people's behavior. Whether it changes people's behavior in the way that the libertarian paternalists believe, which is to align your preferences with what you really want to have, is a different story. But do they care about aligning the preferences with what you want to have or the preferences with what they want to have?
Well, that's exactly the rub here, Bill, which is they claim that, and why they sort of co-opt the term libertarian is that they claim that they're trying to align the preferences with what you would prefer. But in fact, can they really know that? That's exactly the difference here, which is can they see into my brain and know what I really prefer? And this is where they deviate the most from traditional economics.
But let's say for a minute, and this is just a thought experiment, you divide the world into two halves, people who know what they're doing and pay attention and can choose correctly for their own good, and I'll put the quotes around the word correctly, and people who don't know what they're doing and make bad choices. All right, let's say that the world is full of those kind of people. If you use libertarian paternalism, and I consider myself one of the persons who can make choices on my own, as long as I can opt out, what's the problem?
Well, that's right. That's the logic, right? Which is that if I can opt out, what's the problem? And there's no doubt that people make mistakes, right? That's been a part of economic recognition for a long time, that we make decisions based on imperfect information and that sort of thing.
Well, that's what makes markets, right? I mean,
That's
there would be
exactly
no
right.
markets if people didn't do that.
And the other thing, of course, is that traditional economics assume that people learn over time, that you learn from your mistakes and you get better, and when you've got incentives to do that. And that's exactly the move that the libertarian and paternalists make, which is they basically say, well, we're not forcing you to do it. But the catch is that it's a very slippery slope. Say that you change the retirement presumption,
Yeah.
right? And a whole bunch of people opt out, right? Then what are they going to do at that point? The question that's always on the table is, when does the nudge become a shove, a push?
If they don't
right?
get the results
Which
they
is
want.
that they don't get the results that they want. And so behind this veneer on the front end of sort of subtle nudging seems to lie the heavily mailed fist that's basically there ready to force you in the ways that they want to.
So what you're basically saying is, sooner or later, Elizabeth Warren's going to boil the frog.
I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, Bill, but that sounds about right.
And tell me about the CFPB. It has extraordinary powers, does it not?
The CFPB is like something we've never seen in American history, and it is simultaneously the most powerful and least accountable agency we've ever seen in American history. It has none of the traditional checks and balances of a
Who sets the budget? Who sets the CFPB's budget? Can Congress turn the spigot off?
Now, that's one of the amazing things, Bill, is starting with that, which is the CFPB gets a guarantee of 12% of the budget of the Federal Reserve every year, no questions asked. So they get $597 million this year.
Forever?
For 12% forever. So it just goes up from there. To give you a sense of how big 597 million is, they don't have to go to Congress for that. They just tell the Federal Reserve, ship the Brinks truck over to our offices. Give you a sense of that. The Federal Trade Commission, which is the other primary consumer protection agency for the federal government, and it does antitrust policy, their budget is $300 million. So the CFPB's budget is twice as large without any justification to Congress or anybody else.
Where does Congress exercise its constitutional powers over the purse?
Nowhere. They nowhere have authority over the purse, and that's just the beginning of it, right? Which is the second thing is the director of the CFPB is appointed and can only be removed by cause, right? So it's a single director. It's not like a cabinet secretary, which is where how most single directors are. The president can fire him. So he has no accountability to the president, no accountability to Congress. The Federal Reserve can't reverse anything that they do. And courts are required under the so-called Chevron deference to defer to interpretations of its own statutes by the CFPB.
And how long is the term for that?
5-year term, removable only for malfeasance or dereliction of duty.
I'm sorry, how many years? I didn't catch that.
5 years.
5-year term. All right. So every 5 years, at the end of that time, you can put someone new in.
Put someone new in, right?
Okay. But during that time, they have tenure.
Exactly. The president can't control them. Congress can't control them. The Federal Reserve can't control them. And the judiciary has limited powers to control them. It's really quite an extraordinary agency. And its powers are extreme. They can regulate every single consumer credit product in America. And as you well know, Bill, and your listeners would know, a lot of consumer credit is also small business credit, right? How many small businesses have started using personal credit cards at the kitchen table? That falls under the CFPB's jurisdiction to control everything from the corner payday lender all the way up to the to Citibank.
So all forms of credit, but they're not going to get into the equity markets. That's outside their charter.
That is outside their charter.
That's the SEC's or other agencies' charter.
That's right.
So what has the CFPB done so far?
Well, the CFPB has certainly been pretty active. They promulgated a whole bunch of mortgage rules that on so-called ability to pay in qualified mortgages. They've done rulemaking related to debt collection. They've been supervising debt collectors and payday lenders. Brought a bunch of enforcement actions. They've been very aggressive right out of the box.
And when they collect fines, as we're seeing now, more and more agencies are imposing fines that are not statutory fines but are settlements.
Right.
Do they get to keep the money?
That's one of the amazing things here, Bill. Is of course some of it goes back to the victims of fraud or whatever, but they also a lot of it goes into the slush fund that the CFPB has that is growing very rapidly, from what I understand, which they'll use to be able to give away for grants for so-called educational purposes for really basically activist groups.
Wait, it's a granting agency as well?
Exactly right. That they could take money that's unclaimed from these settlements, put it in a slush fund, and then use that to award it to various entities.
Isn't it Congress's job to give away free money?
It should be Congress's job, but this is what we have again. And perhaps not surprisingly, former senior officials at the CFPB seem to have done pretty well in receiving some of those grants so far.
Isn't that interesting? And so the money, keeps finding its way around and around the same circles.
That's right. Funny how that works out, isn't it?
And what have they put in place that would have prevented people from getting liar's loans or taking out mortgages that they couldn't afford to pay back? What impact are they claiming this would have had on the mortgage meltdown back in 2007, 2008?
Well, they've put in a rule on so-called qualified mortgages and ability to pay, and some of that is pretty good. They basically say so-called qualified mortgages are mortgages of the people with decent credit and not overdue, huge payment obligations. What they fail to do in the qualified mortgages, though, is what the evidence suggests was the largest contributor to the foreclosure crisis, which was the proliferation of no down payment mortgages.
Yeah.
So what we know is what drove the financial crisis, even more than ability to pay, was when people's homes fell in value. They went underwater, and basically people made the rational decision to walk away.
You're gambling with house money. Why wouldn't you?
And the CFPB has done nothing about that. And that's one of the fundamental problems with this agency, is that the agency has thought of everything that came out of the financial crisis as a consumer protection problem, when in fact most of the problem, or certainly a lot, was a problem of misaligned incentives, right? Not making necessarily loans to people who couldn't pay, but making loans to people who decided that when their house fell in value, it was a bad investment.
Well, there was moral hazard up and down the line with the consumers, with the brokers, with the banks, with the proprietary trading that was being done on top of that, and the derivatives market. I mean, you couldn't have created a more perfect storm.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that's missing from this agency's rubric. It's got this sort of heroes and villains sort of view, and it's that every consumer was the victim of predatory lending without recognizing that consumers are a little more savvy than that. And to go back to where we started, right? This is one of the problems with predicating policy on this behavioral economics and this libertarian paternalism, which is based on the idea that people are fundamentally irrational, that people, and that people are easily confused.
That's probably a good bet for most people.
It is a pretty good bet to some extent, but what they assume is that people systematically make errors, right? And that people don't learn. And so if you base policy on the idea that people are irrational and they don't respond to incentives, all you're doing is, as you just said, is creating a moral hazard problem and rewarding people who do respond to incentives. And so what we know is that if people recognize an opportunity there, that they'll end up taking advantage of it. So if you assume that people don't think rationally about whether or not to stop paying on their mortgage, right? If you assume that people don't think of their house as an investment, then a lot of people do. A lot of people do think rationally.
Sure, it's a piggy bank too. I mean.
So
what's the connection between the CFPB trying to make sure people don't take out loans they can't afford to pay back, and Congress, which for ages has been trying to push banks into making loans to people who normally wouldn't qualify and couldn't pay them back because they wanted to increase home ownership? Aren't those pushing in opposite directions?
They are, Bill, and that's one of the somewhat amusing things about this new super agency, right, is that they have both the power to enforce access to credit and do consumer protection. So they've basically got this power to sue a bank for making or not making a loan to the exact same person.
At the same time? Hey, but then you can collect a settlement no matter whether you win one or the other one, right? That's a pretty good deal.
We were talking about qualified mortgages and ability to pay, and that's a great example, which is say that a bank only does make loans to people who have good credit, right, and low payment to income ratios. Well, what we know, according to the recent Federal Reserve study, is that there is a correlation between demographic issues such as race and your credit score. And so if you are a bank that only makes loans to people with good credit scores, what are you going to get? You're going to get disparate impact in your lending pool. So if you only make loans that are safe loans, consistent with consumer protection, you're guaranteeing that you're going to run afoul of the disparate impact theory that the CFPB is pushing when it comes on the other end of the ledger. I don't know how the economy can possibly operate with those kind of conflicting mandates.
That's all part of moving away from the rule of law. I mean, if you create enough contradictory laws, you now put regulators and politicians in the position to pick and choose as they go along, and the market is left guessing, where should I be, what should I do? And in many cases, people just leave the field. I mean, as I've been watching the number of banks decline in the United States, there seem to be fewer and fewer larger and larger banks, all of which are lining up at the CFPB to pay homage to the leaders there.
That's right, Bill. And the other thing that you suggest is who can deal with that? Only the biggest banks. Only the biggest bank can hire the lawyers and the lobbyists to be able to make their way through that sort of regulatory thicket. And so I think the legacy of Dodd-Frank, I think, is going to be to promote consolidation of the banking industry, to make the too big to fail banks even bigger because of this regulatory cost, because of the benefits of lobbying activity and being able to work your way through this thicket of regulations, not to mention the entrenchment of the too big to fail subsidy that appears that Dodd-Frank also does.
So it's a form of soft nationalization of the banking business.
That's right, and it's kind of a corporatism type model where the government will use the banks to bring about social goals that they want, and the big banks in return will get protection from the government. And it's kind of a true crony capitalism sort of corporatist model, a relationship between the government and the big banks.
They've been at this for what, 4 years now? How's it working out?
Well, I think as you said, how it's working out, which is we're seeing consolidation of the banking industry. Nobody believes that too big to fail has actually been eliminated. The CFPB, what we've seen is that when it comes to consumer credit, is that all these regulations that have come out of the financial crisis are more and more restricting access to credit. And what we're seeing is that low-income people are being impacted the most. So whether they're losing access to credit cards, losing access to bank accounts, what they are doing is we're seeing double-digit growth with payday lenders and pawn shops. And so we're ending up taking away good options from people, driving them to less attractive options. And I think CFPB, unfortunately, is going to just accelerate that the more and more that they do.
But aren't they trying to crack down on payday lenders, both at the federal and state level? They're going after them for usury laws. I mean, as I've been reading the news, they seem to be on the receiving end of a lot of action these days.
That's exactly right, which is only in Washington do you see increasing demand for a product is suggesting that that's a bad thing. And that's unfortunately the way it works, right, is that the people use payday loans, they use bank overdraft protection, they use pawn shops, because these are people who have limited access to credit. They don't have
hand-to-mouth, yeah.
And so what's happened is we've had this whole regulatory overlay that's taken credit cards away from people. You drive them to payday loans, and the next thing they do is they're going to crack down on payday lenders. When you take away payday loans, what we see is that people are going to either go to online payday lending or they're going to go to pawn shops.
Well, there's also Vinny, right? I mean, you can always go to the Kona Loan Shark to get a loan, right? I mean, that was a thriving business for a long time.
Right, Bill, and you hit the nail on the head, which is why do we have payday lending and these sorts of things? Well, because I'll give you one piece of evidence to back that up. In 1968, the United States Senate did a study, and they found that the second largest revenue source of the mafia was loan sharking, illegal gambling.
No kidding.
Revenue source, but loan sharking was more profitable, so they actually took their gambling revenues and plowed it into their loan sharking operations. And what this led to was people in the 70s, consumer advocates, to recognize it's better off to give people access to products like payday loans, even though we're expensive. And we know we don't like payday loans. I don't like payday loans, but it's better to have somebody have a payday lender than to get their legs broken.
Well, what are the statistics? I mean, what were the collection levels of loan sharks compared to banks and other forms of loans? I imagine they got paid back most of the time.
Yes, they got paid back most of the time, and yet they still had very high interest rates. But I'll give you another anecdote. In the 1970s, Fat Tony Salerno was indicted by the federal government. He had $80 million a day outstanding of loan sharking loans.
No kidding.
on the streets of New York City, and that was just New York City. So loan sharking was a big deal, and it's always been the case. Which is, you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, and what you see is when you try to do the kind of things that Washington has done and what the CFPB is doing, where you take away people's choices, what happens is they get pushed down the ladder. They get pushed from credit cards to payday loans, from payday loans to pawn shops, and down to Fat Tony on the corner. And that's how this ends up, right? And in the past, the consumer advocates at some point say, okay, this doesn't make any sense. We've got to, there are laws of supply and demand, and there's a law of unintended consequences, and we've got to make our policies fit within that. The problem with Washington right now when it comes to these issues is they just want to wish away the unintended consequences of their regulation. And I think a lot of people are feeling that. You're seeing it for consumers. You're seeing it for small businesses. There was an article recently in the Wall Street Journal about small businesses using pawn shops now because they can't get access to credit and that sort of thing. Yeah. It's all very counterproductive.
Well, it'll be interesting to track over time. I mean, we know how well the war on drugs has worked and what that did to the supply and demand equation on that side. And I guess if the same thing happens to loans, this should be pretty bullish for loan sharks.
Yeah, I mean, in the short run, it's payday lenders, prepaid card issuers. Those guys are really booming right now, and the concern is that the kind of big brother in Washington
keep squeezing.
Take that away, take those options away from people, and drives them to still further down the ladder.
So I guess if we circle back to the original premise, which was the libertarian or the soft paternalism, one keeps track. One can see how you keep squeezing on the snake until you're forced to deal with levels in the market that are tougher and tougher to control. Eventually, you're on the street with the mafia, and I don't think soft paternalism works with them. Now you're into who's got more guns.
Yeah, that's right, and that's the question that CFPB, for instance, did a study on overdraft protection. They've done things on payday loans, and they never ask the right question, which is if we take away that there are a lot of people who use payday loans. Taking away payday loans isn't magically going to take away the demand for payday loans. You're not magically going to make people save more money if you take away a payday loan. And you have to ask yourself the question, what happens to those people who are using payday loans? They're going to start bouncing checks? Are they because we know some of the studies show that evictions go up, bounce checks go up, utility shutoffs go up, use of bank overdraft protection goes up, right? It is. You squeeze the balloon and it pops up
somewhere.
It's the question that they're not really focusing on.
Well, they could just turn around and, by law, double everyone's salary who makes less than a certain amount. Wouldn't that fix the problem?
I guess they're going to raise the minimum wage. So I think, apparently there's no unintended consequences from that either.
If you think about it, that's the knob they're going to reach for, right?
That seems to be it, and it's the same basic economic errors, right? When it comes to these things.
Not to change the subject, but we're watching this happen now in the restaurant business. And I think it was Applebee's who recently, simultaneous with, I can't call them strikes because it's really not the workers that are striking. These are activists that are picketing fast food places. They announced they're going to be moving to a touchscreen ordering system in their restaurants.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they're renting them. What they're saying is you can rent our touchscreens for 45 cents an hour compared to the minimum wage. How'd you like to do that? You'll need fewer waiters.
Oh, right. So the customers will just order themselves.
Yeah, you order it yourself. You always get it right. You get your bill right. You put your credit card right through the machine, and you're done. And you make waiters too expensive, and that's the choice that the restaurant owners are going to take. Where else does that start happening in the economy?
Yeah, that's that I hadn't seen that, but that's exactly what you would predict.
The only way to make all this work at the end of the day is to control everything.
That's exactly right. That's the logic of interventionism, is that there's always unintended consequences, and unless you can control everything all at once, then you're stuck, and that's exactly what Hayek warned.
What makes you think that's not the goal?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, Bill, and I mean, you alluded to it earlier, which is what it looks like is sort of big business, big government, big labor kind of carving up the economy, a somewhat stagnant economy, and figuring out who gets what. And part of that is what you're talking about earlier, I think, which is the negotiations that then happen between big business and big labor in a world in which it's impossible to comply with all the laws at once. These rule of law issues that you alluded to earlier, I think, become somewhat troubling in this world.
Well, it's a world that Kafka described very well.
It really is. Or, Hernando de Soto, when he talks about developing countries where you simply cannot comply with the law and run a business. And so it's basically a question of how much clout do you have to get discretionary relief from the law.
But that's a very old and successful model. We are all sinners and come here for absolution.
Yeah, exactly. And we see that with, the rollout of the Obamacare website and that sort of thing, and the waivers that are being extended to that and everything else, which is it's just this negotiation process of whether or not you can get the government to take it easy on you.
Well, Todd, I really appreciate your time. It's been fascinating to delve into this, and we'll hope to have you back again to follow up.
Sure thing, Bill. Great talking with you.
You've been listening to Real Clear Radio Hour. This is your host, Bill Frezza, and we've been speaking with Todd Zawicki, George Mason University Foundation Professor of Law and editor of the Supreme Court Economic Review. Thanks for being with us.